Professor Maria Klatte
Professor Dr. Maria Klatte
Entwicklungs- und Kognitionspsychologie an der Technischen
from the
Universität
Development
Kaiserslautern
and
ist die
Cognition Psychology
Studienleiterin des
Department
Moduls
of
Kindliche
Kaiserslautern
Entwicklung.
University.
Frau Klatte, bitte.
She was heading the study on
So thank you for the
child
introduction. I'm happy to
development.
present today the findings from the NORAH study on effects of aircraft noise on children's reading and quality of life. We have a number of prior studies in this field, and these proved lower reading performance in highly exposed children, relative consistently across studies, and these effects were, as a rule, small in magnitude, and sometimes they were confined to the most difficult test items. Findings concerning effects on attention and memory and other cognitive function yielded inconsistent results. Adverse effects were found in some studies, but not in all studies. And another finding from prior studies is that high exposure to aircraft noise is associated with lower socioeconomic status, or SES. We know from large-scale educational and health studies that low SES is associated, is a risk factor in children's cognitive development, in children's health and academic achievement, and especially with respect to reading acquisition. And so, when we compare performance in children differing in aircraft noise exposure, we have to very, very carefully control the SES and SES-related variables. A groundbreaking study in this field is the range study, and I'm very happy that we have here today authors from the range study, Stephen Stansfeld, Elise van Kamp, and Irene van Kamp. In the range study, about 3,000 children were included, which came from the vicinity of international airports, London Heathrow, Amsterdam Schiphol, and Madrid. And the main result was a linear exposure effect relationship between children's aircraft noise exposure at school and lower reading performance. Especially a 20 dB increase in aircraft noise at school was associated with a decrease in reading scores of 1/5 or to 1/8 of a standard deviation. In view of this evidence, one might ask why we ran a further study on this topic. And the reasons are, first, that the situation at Frankfurt Airport differs somewhat from the situation of children in prior studies. For example, the children's aircraft noise exposure here in the Rhine-Main region is much lower when compared to prior studies. In the aircraft noise levels at school in the range study reached 77 dB LEQ, and here in Frankfurt-Main, the LEQ at the most exposed schools were 59 dB. In fact, schools with 59 dB exposure level have been included in prior studies as unexposed controlled schools. And second, in the Rhine-Main region, the children, of course, learn to read in German and not in English or in Dutch. And from reading research, it is clear that the process of reading acquisition and factors affecting this process depend on the specific orthography, especially on the consistency between the phoneme-grapheme mappings. And third, of course, the NORAH study was expected to make a further and incremental contribution to our knowledge on noise effects in children, and thus verbal precursors of reading acquisition and quality of classroom instruction were included as outcome variables, and potential confounders on the individual level, on the level on classes, were controlled. Concerning sample recruitment, our first step was to send out questionnaires to all 297 public primary schools in the NORAH study area. And although we did what we could to get back these questionnaires, the response was 160 completed questionnaires. And as expected, inspection of these 160 questionnaires showed that aircraft noise exposure at school was associated with lower SES and a higher proportion of children with a migration background in the schools. Out of these 160 schools, we selected 29 schools for participation in the study. And schools with the highest exposure level were selected first, and the remaining schools were matched for SES and percentage of children with non-German first language in the second grades. Schools whose headmasters reported extreme levels of annoyance from other sources of noise, such as industry or road traffic or railway traffic, were excluded in order to have a clear focus on the effects of aircraft noise. This map shows the location of the 29 schools around the airport, and the green circles here represent those schools with highest exposure level, which means 55 to 59 dB. In the selected schools, the parents were informed about the study by parents' evenings and by written information, and these informations were translated into 9 different languages, which was very, very helpful because we had a high proportion of non-German parents, in which we would not have reached otherwise without these translated letters. And as a result, from these endeavors, we got parental consent from 77% of the parents, which is a quite satisfying response quote. All in all, 85 classes with about 1,200 children participated. For reading outcomes, we had complete data from 1,090 children, and for quality of life variables, we had complete data from 1,058 children. All these children were second graders, and the mean age was 8 years and 4 months, and 60% had a migration background. Concerning the tests, we used a standardized German reading test and a memory test that required answering questions about a story which you heard before. Non-verbal abilities were assessed by means of a short form of the colored progressive matrices, where you see such a pattern here. And you have to select the item which is missing in the pattern. For verbal precursors of reading, we assessed 4 components of phonological processing according to what has been found in reading research. These are phonological awareness and short-term memory. For example, you hear 2 pseudo-words differing in length from 3 to 7 syllables, and you have to say whether they are same or different. This is short-term memory. And phoneme perception and rapid access to phonological representations in long-term memory. So, for example, you have here such an answer letter with these pictures here, and you have to cross out all words with an initial sound B, and you have to put a circle under all words which do not have the initial sound B. Parents' questionnaires comprised items on socioeconomic status, and this was calculated as a composite score from education, current professional position, and income. And further on, we assessed ratings of the children's physical and mental well-being. The teacher questionnaires included questions concerning methods of reading instructions during the first grades and ratings of annoyance due to aircraft noise at school, and the effects of aircraft noise on the children and on the quality of instruction from the perspective of the class teachers. And furthermore, the class teachers provided individual ratings of proficiency in German language for each child with a migration background, because the variance in German language proficiency is, of course, immense in these children. And for concreteness, here's an example For a rating scale of the parents' questionnaire concerning the child's physical well-being, statements such as, during the last 4 weeks my child felt sick, had to be answered on a 4-point rating scale ranging from never to almost every time. Concerning noise levels, these were calculated for the time period of 12 months before data collection in the schools. And noise levels were estimated for each individual child on the base of radar data, as Ulrich Müller had told us yesterday. And these calculations were performed for different times of day in order to take into account the specific daily routines of children in this age. For example, we have nighttime noise here from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. in order to take into account that children go to bed earlier than adults, of course. And road traffic and railroad noise and classroom insulation and classroom reverberation were also assessed and controlled in the statistical analysis. Data acquisition was done in groups of whole classes and took 3 to 4 lessons per class. And for the auditory verbal tests, such as phonological short-term memory and speech perception, we used wireless headphones in order to rule out potential effects of classroom reverberation, of seat position, distance from the sound source, and noise from outside. Concerning the noise levels, the exposure levels ranged from 39 to 59 dB at school and from 40 to 61 dB at home. And correlation analysis proved that children's SES was unrelated to aircraft noise levels at home and at school, and thus our matching of schools according to SES was successful. Strong correlations were found between exposure at home and exposure at school, as well as exposure during the day and during the night. The correlation between noise at school and at home is depicted here. And here you see the same result from the range study. That's absolutely comparable. But due to these strong correlations, these studies do not allow conclusions concerning differential effects of these types of noise exposure. Concerning reading, we used a standardized German reading test with 3 subtests: word reading, sentence reading, and text reading. And we calculated also a global reading score from the averages from the subtests. And the raw scores were transformed into T-scores, standard scores, and T-scores are normally distributed with a mean 50 and standard deviation 10. And that means that scores between 40 and 60 T-points represent an average reading ability. We ran multi-level regression analysis in order to take into account the clustered structure of the data here, children in classes. In such a design, you can't treat a child as an individual case, of course, due to class dependencies. In the unadjusted model, only aircraft noise at school was included as predictor variable, and in the partially adjusted model, we included a number of predictor variables on the individual level, such as age, gender, SES, German language proficiency, or number of books at home, which is an indicator for the quality of home literacy environment. And class-level predictors, such as class size, the proportion of children with a migration background, parental involvement, class size. And in the final fully adjusted model, this was further adjusted for classroom insulation and road traffic and railway noise at school. After full adjustment for all these variables, we found a significant association between aircraft noise at school and lower reading scores. And this association was best described as a linear exposure effect relationship. A 20 dB increase of aircraft noise at school was associated with a decrease in children's global reading scores by 1/5 of a standard deviation. That means T 2 points on the T-score scale, and concerning the statistical effect size, this is a clear replication of the range results. Significant effects of aircraft noise were found for the global reading scores and for the subtests word reading and text reading. In terms of learning time, a 10 dB increase in aircraft noise corresponds to a reading delay of about 1 month, which corresponds to 1 point on the T-score scale. That means statistically, the most exposed children in the Rhine-Main region lag behind for 2 months behind their peers with least exposure. In the sample, we had a high proportion of migrant children, 60%. This is not unusual for German metropolitan areas. And in European countries, and I have to say especially in Germany, migrant background is strongly associated with lower reading achievement. Thus, one might expect that aircraft noise exposure is especially detrimental for these children, as it constitutes a further obstacle for reading acquisition. Contrary to this prediction, in a recent study conducted in South Africa, an effect of aircraft noise on reading was only found in children with English, the language of instruction, as a first language, but not in children who were learning English as a second language. And in view of these puzzling results and these questions, we did separate analysis in children with and without a migration background. In children with a migration background, the effect of aircraft noise was in the same direction but did not reach significance. Of course, we don't consider these children as immune or something. To our view, this result is best explained as a problem of statistical power due to an accumulation of risk factors in this group. Our data confirmed lower SES and less stimulating home literacy environment in the migrant children. In addition, according to the teachers' ratings, about half of these children still struggled with the German language. Due to this unfavorable conditions, the comparably small additional effect of aircraft noise might be very difficult to verify statistically. On the other hand, when you consider the children without a migration background, a 20 dB increase in aircraft noise was associated with a 2.8 point decrement in the global reading scores, corresponding to a reading delay of about 3 months. For long-term memory and phonological abilities, no effects of aircraft noise were found. Now I turn to quality of life ratings. These were assessed by parents' questionnaires and by the children's responses from the standardized interviews in the class. Parents' ratings of their child's physical well-being were assessed through items like, during the last 4 weeks, my child had stomachache or headache, or my child felt sick. And the scale reliability was good with 0.77. As you can see from the figure, overall ratings are positive. The score 5 represents the best possible answer on the scale. But however, we found a significant effect of aircraft noise after full adjustment. That means a 20 dB increase in aircraft noise is associated with a decrease in physical health ratings by 1/4 point of this rating scale. Concerning mental well-being, the items were, for example, during the last 4 weeks, my child was grumpy and bad-tempered, or my child got angry easily. And here we found roughly the same results. Again, overall ratings were positive, but again here we found a significant linear exposure effect relationship with 20 dB increase in aircraft noise is associated with a decrease in rating scores by 1/5 points on the scale. One could say mental and physical health ratings are a bit less positive in the highly exposed children. Finally, children's ratings of well-being at school. These were assessed through items like, I feel fine at school, or at school we are learning exciting things, or after the holidays I look forward to going to school again. There was a 4-point rating scale from absolutely true to absolutely wrong to absolutely true. And again, overall ratings are positive. Second graders like to go to school still. That changes someone. But again, we see an effect of aircraft noise exposure at school. After full adjustment, a 20 dB increase in aircraft noise is associated with a decrease in ratings by 1/4 points on the scale. We were also interested in the effects of aircraft noise on the quality of instruction at school. And for this aim, we analyzed the questionnaires from the class teachers. We found remarkably consistent responses from the teachers from highly exposed schools. That means from schools where exposure exceeded 55 dB. 20 out of 21 teachers from these schools reported severe disruptions of classroom instruction due to aircraft noise. Disruption ratings were strongly correlated with aircraft noise levels at school. The correlation coefficient was 0.85, and that means from the calculated noise level at school, you may predict what the class teacher says concerning impairments of instruction. And the strong correlations with objective measures of exposure confirms the seriousness and the validity of these class teachers' judgments. Regarding the specific type of impairment, more than 50% of these teachers reported frequent interruptions of discourse and noticeable distractions of the children due to aircraft noise. And taken together, this study proved adverse effects of aircraft noise exposure on children's reading acquisition after full adjustment for potential confounders on both the individual and the class level. And in combination with prior studies, especially the range study, this strong consistency and we think is very strong evidence for a causal effect of aircraft noise on children's reading acquisition. Although small in statistical effect size in terms of learning time, the effects correspond to reading delays of 2 to 3 months in the most exposed when compared to the least exposed children. In our second graders, 2 to 3 months constitute 10 to 15% of the total time of instruction at school. And concerning the judgment of the interpretation of these results, we should also keep in mind that this is a cross-sectional study, and we know nothing concerning long-term effects. We do not know whether the effects will remain stable or diminish or increase in later grades. And when thinking about this, one has to keep in mind that for the vast majority of these children, the exposure will endure or even increase. The mechanisms between aircraft noise and reading are still unclear. In this study, we found no evidence for a mediating role of verbal precursors of reading. However, the teachers' reports indicate severe impairment of classroom instruction due to aircraft noise. In educational psychology, one of the most important criteria for instructional quality is efficient utilization of the learning time. The teacher's rating indicates that under conditions of aircraft noise, part of the lesson's time is lost. And the resulting decrease in quality of instruction may contribute to the effect on reading. And we should keep in mind that such adverse conditions are not only present during reading instruction, but throughout the lesson's time. And thus, future studies should also include other domains of academic achievement, such as spelling and math. And before finishing, I would like to thank my colleagues from University of Kaiserslautern and from the NORAH Consortium and from the NORAH Scientific Advisory Board, and especially all the children and parents and teachers who participated in the study. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Just take a seat over there. The next speaker is a member of the External Quality Assurance of the NORAH Children's Study. It's Dr. Irene van Kamp. She's from the National Institute of Public Health and the Environment in Bilthoven in the Netherlands. Please.
Nearly broke my neck. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to give a little evaluation of Maria's study on child development in relation to noise. I speak hopefully on behalf of Jürgen Helbroek, who's not here, I think, today, and the other members of the WBQ. And I want to take you back to the period before NORAH. Hardly imaginable, but it existed. And at that time, I think behind all these studies was the question, the key question, are children more vulnerable to noise? And if that's true, do they need more protection than other groups in the population? This vulnerability or susceptibility is mentioned in many, many reviews, among which of Stephen Stansfeld, the WHO. In the framework of ICANA, we have written reviews. But there's actually a very limited number of studies. So I don't know, we were just discussing, Martin Rüssli and I, it's hard to get children's studies financed. I have no idea why, but it's too specific, and for some reason, grant givers like larger studies in the general population better. I'm not sure. Most studies are small-scaled, and the effects of air traffic noise on school children have been studied most. In particular, the cognitive effects, mentioning the LA study, the Munich study, the Ranch study, and before that, the West London school studies. A little further on my prologue. In general, we can say, based on what we had before NORAH, children are more vulnerable to noise, especially with regards to their cognitive development. And that's not per se because they're more vulnerable. Yes, they have better hearing, but they can ignore noise better. But they are in a very, very vulnerable period with regards to their development and learning, specifically language acquisition. Schools and preschools are vulnerable places, and children have less well coping skills to deal with noise. And I've been participating in a preschool study, and you actually see in the even younger group that children are not protected. They just respond very physically to the noise, and they really indicate, even at the age of 4, children indicate that noise disturbs them. If you see any drawings in this talk, they are of these younger children who were being asked to draw how they experienced noise, and they really know what you're talking about. Quite surprising. Maria already dwelt on the mechanisms, but up to the period 5 years ago, we thought, apart from memory and attention, disturbed sleep might be the mechanism. Learned helplessness, Gary Evans has written a lot about, but there's many other mechanisms, and in that time we were not sure, and as I understand well, we're still puzzling on the mechanisms. Now, moving to the NORAH child study, the research report describes in great detail the outcomes of a large study among 1,243 children, 1,185 parents, and 85 teachers in the Rhine-Main region as part of the NORAH study, and adding largely, I think, to the knowledge of the NORAH database. Can I have some water, please? Now, what are the key questions of the child study? Quite ambitious. What are the adverse effects of aircraft noise in children? the role of underlying linguistic and cognitive function in these effects, the effects on health and well-being in children, their bother and annoyance, both of parents, children and their teachers, and finally the overall effects of aircraft noise on everyday school life. The main finding of the study is the association between aircraft noise and decreased reading comprehension after a judgment for key confounders. And this, the second statement, is the most important, at much lower levels than we have found before. So the Ranch study dealt with higher noise levels of exposure, but the effects show up also at the low levels around Frankfurt Airport. The results are highly in line with those of, for instance, the EU Fifth Framework Ranch study, although the effect size, I would say, and we judge, is modest. It's not a huge effect, but very consistent. Now, before I go into the other effects, I do want to mention the specific remarkable finding that Maria already showed us, that the effect is only significant in children without a migrant background, and it really, we agree as a VB crew that this could be due to a lack of power. We do need much more factors and in-depth studies to understand this phenomena. There's a masking effect in the association, and it could be that the factors that are not identified in children who already have a language deficit explain this finding. As in the other studies, there's no direct association between aircraft noise and technical reading, but the changes in language, visual coordination are assumed in the report. Well, we always talked about comprehensive reading, which is really reading and understanding and remembering what has been read and being able to reproduce it later. And that's very different from what you would call technical reading. One of the other main findings of, and I think that's a real asset of this study, that it really broadly covered the effects, not just the cognitive effects, is the effect on quality of life, health-related quality of life, as reported by the parents, and the annoyance ratings in the children. That has done before, but it's good that it's repeated, I think. And as we see, there are the annoyance scores of the children are comparable to those of their parents. I'm not sure how this one works. But as you see in many studies, these are the children and parental data on annoyance from the Ranch study in the three British, Dutch, and Spanish groups. And you often see a dip at the higher levels. Now, if you consider that NORAH is around here, apparently there's a dip here as well. And we can't really explain it clearly, but it's very consistent. In the children, you saw that you can't see it very well, but they scored much higher at the lower end, maybe because the hearing is better, and they score lower than the parents at the higher end. And I always thought that's because children don't think politics. So actually, it's better to have the children's annoyance ratings than the adult ratings, because those are filled with messages to policymakers. I think even Peter Lerger found this phenomena in the children. Now, going to the evaluation, because that's what this talk all about. Starting with strengths, we think that this is a very well-designed study with very high scientific quality, replicating previous findings, as mentioned, and the added value really lies in extending and improving of the previous work in terms of the cognitive instrument used, the detailed information about migration, language skills, and I will not dwell on it, but the stratification of SES schools. It's all very well thought out. There's a lot of attention for social behavior at school and at home, and also a very particular point was the judgment for acute exposure. So in our previous studies, the effects we found could be an effect of the acute noise exposure levels. So the children were actually wearing headphones, so they were not disturbed by the acute exposures. The research questions and hypotheses more than before, I think, and Stephen can disagree later if he would like to, are grounded in theory and empiry, and there's a methodological rigidity in the choice of statistical judgment for confounders, the level of statistical power and sampling, and all of that together is an improvement on previous work. Now, of course, there's some limitations. I had to look and really search for those. Sorry. For some reason. Okay. As mentioned by Maria, there's a difference between, it's very hard to disentangle in case of aircraft noise, the effect of home and school exposure. It could even be a side effect of disturbed sleep by aircrafts. Of course, there's the curfew, but children sleep earlier than adults, so the curfew doesn't cover their sleeping time. There's an extreme high association between the exposures, so we cannot say anything about it. But what does it mean? It means that the children are exposed at home and at school, and as was the case in Ranch. And there's very little time of little opportunity for the children to recover from the exposure, either from the school or the home situation. That's very different from road traffic noise, where even if you have a quiet site at the back of the house, people can recover and children can recover. So this is a real important point for the future to address. And related is the aspect of the accumulation of aircraft noise and road traffic noise. Since schools with high levels of road traffic noise, which is methodologically very sound and precise, it takes away the opportunity to compare groups, children who do have aircraft noise plus road traffic and children who have aircraft noise solely. And again, there's a relation with the restoration. I mean, the home and the dwelling is the place where children should be able to recover from stressors in the daytime. But that's really what I could find, and we could find in terms of limitations. There's some strength to be added to this, what I already said. The NORAH study accounts for the latest insight in the cognitive aspects of reading from a developmental as well as a that's a very hard word, pedagogical point of view, which is really new in the field. And finally, and very important for the future, it comes up with several interesting hypotheses regarding the mechanisms and future directions for research. Having said all that, I would like to congratulate Maria Klatte and her team for a well-designed and balanced study, and specifically thanks for the great collaboration in this work. And thank you much for your attention.
Thank you. Just take a seat over there, please. Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Stansfeld from the Centre of Psychiatry at the Queen Mary University in London. He's the external reviewer of the study. Please.
Thanks very much, Chair, and I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to comment on this excellent study. So my title is NORAH in Context, Responses to the Child Study. I'll apologize that there will be some, I will be saying some of the things again that have already been said, but I hope perhaps I put a slightly different perspective on things. I'll talk a little bit in more detail about some of the earlier studies of aircraft noise and children's learning. I'll compare the RANCH and the NORAH studies and their findings in a bit more detail. And I'll also talk about some more recent studies that inform the RANCH and NORAH findings, and finally talk about the implications of the findings and possibilities for future research. As we've heard, children might be a particularly susceptible group to noise effects and perhaps other environmental stresses as well. And that can be due to the fact that they're exposed at critical periods of their life in terms of learning. They also perhaps have lack of developed coping repertoires, and that may be also specifically to do with sounds and how they can differentiate sounds from the background, for instance. Also, learning and teaching are potentially vulnerable tasks, and that may occur in vulnerable settings, which are schools or homes exposed to high levels of noise. So a little bit of a historical diversion. The first study really looking at aircraft noise and children's learning was from Sheldon Cohen around Los Angeles, LAX airport, comparing children in highly noise-exposed schools with quieter schools, and finding that those highly noise-exposed children were more likely to fail on cognitive tasks and give up on cognitive tasks, that they were also more distractible than children from quiet schools, and also had higher blood pressure. Lorraine Maxwell and Gary Evans carried out a study in New York looking at much younger children and finding here that noise-exposed children showed significant deficits on a standardized reading test, and that also those impairments were partially mediated by impaired speech perception. Maria has carried out a number of different studies in this area, particularly also looking at background speech noise and classroom noise, and finding that those exposures to noise in children seem to particularly affect speech perception, which I think that background research was one of the reasons why speech perception was looked at as a potential hypothesis for the mechanism of aircraft noise and reading comprehension in the NORAH study. Our own studies on noise and children's learning began with the school's health and environment study around Heathrow Airport. Again, this was a comparison of highly noise-exposed schools with quiet schools. And what we found was that children exposed to higher noise had higher annoyance levels, but also in this early study, a 6-month delay in reading comprehension in those noise-exposed children. But this was quite a small study. It had a number of problems with it. So we tried to carry out a replication called the West London School Study. And in this study, we found that aircraft noise was not associated with the mean reading score, with any of the memory tests, attention or stress responses, and we also measured some hormones as well in urine and found no differences between high and low noise. Again, we did find that high noise annoyance was associated, there was more high noise annoyance in the aircraft noise-exposed children. And when we looked in more detail at the reading tests, we did find that the higher aircraft noise exposure was associated with impaired reading on the more difficult test items. Now, a number of problems with these earlier studies. They tend to be cross-sectional. They tend to have relatively small sample sizes. And when you're looking at a small effect, you need a bigger sample size. And in some of the studies, insufficient adjustments for confounding. And, of course, no assessment for exposure-effect relationships, which you can't really do if you're simply comparing high and low exposure groups. A very interesting study in this area is the Munich Airport study, which looked at the longitudinal study looking at the closure of the old airport and the opening of a new airport. They tested for a number of different outcomes: blood pressure, attention, long-term memory, working memory, reading, motivation, and annoyance. At baseline, what they found was that aircraft noise exposure was associated with deficits in long-term memory, reading, motivation, and annoyance. And what was really interesting was that after the airport closed, those impairments were found to diminish within 2 years of that airport closing. And then the same impairments developed in the newly noise-exposed group around the new airport within 2 years of that new airport opening. So this made some suggestion that if you removed the source of noise, these effects might be reversible. Now, there haven't been a large number of studies looking at the gradient in exposure. This is an early study from New York City, relatively crude, looking at schools geocoded into 5 aircraft noise contours, and the outcome was the proportion reading below the reading level for the school. And what they did find was a dose-response relationship for the percentage reading below grade level, and that increased as the noise level increased. But there were a number of limitations to this study. We carried out a study around Heathrow, so-called SAT study, using British national standardized scores for Key Stage 2 at age 11, and that was related to aircraft, 8 levels of aircraft noise exposure in 11,000 children from 128 schools. And we did find that aircraft noise was significantly related to poorer reading performance. And interestingly, it was not associated with control outcomes, spelling and handwriting, which we didn't expect to be affected by noise. Also, again, they test for mathematics, and we found a relationship with mathematics, which we didn't expect, but I guess is not surprising because it's another complex task, and it seems that particularly these complex tasks are more affected by noise. However, after adjusting our results for socioeconomic status, the association between high noise exposure and poorer performance was reduced and no longer statistically significant. So, socioeconomic position has already been measured is an important factor in these sorts of associations. It could be that environmental stresses are an intervening factor, a mediating factor between low socioeconomic position and health. Alternatively, it could be that socioeconomic position is independently related to the environmental stresses such as noise, and also, as we know, independently related to ill health. So thus it's more of a confounding factor. Certainly one needs to take it into account in these sorts of studies. So this was the picture at the time that we began the RIVM study. Over 20 studies reported that noise adversely affects children's academic performance. But the RANCH study, as Irene has said, was a European-funded study looking at exposure-effect relationships between chronic exposure to aircraft noise and road traffic and child health and cognition, carried out in three countries: the Netherlands, Spain, United Kingdom. Now, I'm going to compare some of the methodology of RANCH and NORAH, and I've highlighted some of the points of NORAH in red just to distinguish them. In both studies, this was a study of primary schools, of state-funded primary schools, and a rather similar procedure took place in terms of matching. In NORAH, high aircraft noise schools were selected first, and I think that's what we did too, and the remaining schools were matched on child SES, migration background, and German language proficiency. Similarly, in RANCH, we matched schools for socioeconomic status based on eligibility for free school meals and main language spoken. You've seen this photo before. This is simply a large aircraft overhead of kind of typical housing around Heathrow Airport. So School noise exposure prediction, we've heard in detail about the noise exposure, really pretty much the same sort of classification in NORAH as in RANCH, except that the hours for defining days and night just slightly different, but not really significantly so. What about the procedures in RANCH and NORAH? The RANCH children were aged 9 to 10. The NORAH children are just slightly younger, 7 to 10. In both studies, classroom-based testing using standardized test procedures and instructions. In RANCH, we did measure actually acute noise during testing in the classroom, and we adjusted for that in the analyses. But in NORAH, a more sophisticated approach has been taken, the use of headphones to try and exclude ambient noise during testing, which I think is definitely an advance. And in both studies, we got the parents to complete questionnaires. These are the measures in the RANCH study. I'm not going to go through them in detail, but a reading scale, a number of different memory scales, noise annoyance using adapted ISO questions, and mental health using the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. In the NORAH study, again, reading comprehension, perhaps more detailed than our study, a number of memory tests, and also more of a focus on speech perception, and mental health, in a way, measuring more mental well-being using the Kindle scale. This is just a couple of photographs from the RANCH study. I think the notable thing, and this is, you can see a microphone on a roof on a school, but one thing to say is that the quality of a number of the school buildings, at least in the UK, was not that great. And these were single-story buildings where noise not only would come in through the windows, but possibly in through the roof. And that's just a testing. A couple of our researchers in their RANCH T-shirts. Now, this is just a little bit about the noise exposure characteristics of RANCH and NORAH. Really, the important thing here is what you see at the bottom of the slide, that the range in that last row, you can see that the range of noise exposure was much higher in the RANCH study than in the NORAH study. Also, a really interesting statistic, as you can see in the footnote, that the NORAH study, 100% of classrooms were double glazed. In the RANCH study, only 43.8% of classrooms were double or triple glazed. Adjustment for confounding factors. Maria talked quite a bit about this. I'm not going to spend much time on this. A strength of both of these studies was that they took confounding factors much more into account than previous studies, and NORAH has gone further than RANCH in including some adjustments at the level of classes or schools in terms of SES, class size, migration background in the class, etc. And also then additionally adjusting for road traffic and railway noise. Now, turning to the results, as Maria has said, in both RANCH and NORAH studies was a significant relationship between chronic aircraft noise exposure and reading comprehension. In the RANCH study, we also found an association with recognition memory, but like the NORAH study, we didn't really find much in terms of episodic memory, working memory, sustained attention. And this is a linear relationship, a striking linear relationship in both studies. So the fact that it's a linear relationship and the noise exposure in the NORAH study was less, doesn't really matter. You're just slightly further down the distribution. But I think this is a very striking result that NORAH, in a completely independent study, finds the same sort of effect. And in RANCH, a 5 dB increase in aircraft noise exposure was equivalent to a 2-month reading delay in the UK and a 1-month reading delay in the Netherlands. In NORAH, a 10 dB increase in aircraft noise was associated with a decrement on the reading test of 1/10 of a standard deviation, corresponding to a 1-month reading delay. In terms of other associations, in both studies, again, an association with annoyance, and in the NORAH study, associations with physical ill health in the children and mental ill health in the children, which we didn't find in our study. We did find on the SDQ, which has a special subscale on hyperactivity, a relationship between aircraft noise and hyperactivity, but that wasn't a hypothesized finding, it was a chance finding in a way. Annoyance, as Irene has already said, it's interesting that children at the higher noise levels don't seem to be as annoyed as the teachers, and in both the Ranch and the NORAH studies, it's quite clear that the teachers are very aggravated by aircraft noise and report that it does really interfere in classroom activities. Home aircraft noise and reading comprehension, well, you've seen this before. There's a high correlation between aircraft noise exposure at home and at school, and that's not surprising because primary school children tend to live close to their schools. Similarly, also, there's a high correlation between daytime school exposure and nighttime home exposure in the Ranch study, although we had a clever statistician at the time who managed to look at it and said that she thought that, if anything, the important noise exposure was school day noise exposure and not nighttime exposure. And certainly when we looked at sleeping difficulties in the children, they did not explain the cognitive impairments in relation to aircraft noise. Now, effects of noise and reading in migrants. I apologize if I'm going to talk about this again, but I think it's a really important issue. And I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the South African studies, which were partial replications of the Ranch study, in which a number of children living in studying in schools close to Durban International Airport completed the Suffolk Reading Scale, which was the scale that we used in the Ranch study, and they were compared to a control group with much lower noise levels. 49% of this sample had English as a first language, and at baseline, there was a significant association of aircraft noise with poorer reading comprehension in the English as a first language group, but not in the English as a second language group. Then the airport was relocated to a different bit of Durban in May 2010 to an area just kind of surrounded by sugarcane fields and nothing much else. And at follow-up in 2010 and 2011, the high noise level had fallen to 55 dBA, and no difference could be found between noise-exposed and control groups in terms of reading. Now, look at the mean values here. If you, this is at baseline, you can see that the English as a first language group in the experimental group had quite low levels of reading comprehension compared to the control values of English as a first language, about a 10-point difference there, whereas if you look at the English as a second language, you can see that for a starter, both levels are lower in English as a second language, both levels of reading comprehension, and they don't differ very much. And this just shows the difference, again, illustrated graphically, of English as a first language and English as a second language in that control group. So, does this mean a lack of noise effects in people from ethnic minorities? The lack of noise effect on reading in migrants in NORAH, and a lack of effect on those with English as a second language in South Africa? It's striking that in NORAH, 60% of the population had a non-German born parent, which is, I reckon, very high. It was overall it was 12% in Ranch, but 22% in the UK sample. So potential explanations for this. Well, I think socioeconomic status is a strong potential explanation. The migrant population are likely to be lower in socioeconomic status. Language proficiency has to be taken into account. I know NORAH took extreme care in adjusting for language proficiency, but nevertheless, I think those sort of statistical adjustments there may still be some residual confounding there. In the Ranch study, we found that lower maternal education predicted poorer reading comprehension, and it's likely again that in many of the migrants they will have lower maternal education. Also, long-standing illness. We found that long-standing illness in the family and in the child predicted lower reading comprehension and in a migrant population is likely to have more long-standing illness too. So lack of power may be an issue, but I think all these things contribute to making lack of power, in a way one needed more power to actually overcome all these potential confounding factors. But certainly it seems that there's the same relationship within the ethnic minorities, there's the same shape of relationship, it's simply not significant. Now, what about possible mechanisms for noise effects on learning? As you see, there's been a lot of research in this area, but still the knowledge on what specific mechanisms are important is unclear. Traditionally, it's been felt that it's to do with tuning out of attention, going back as far as Donald Broadbent, that children tend, when they're exposed to a lot of noise, they tend to focus very narrowly and exclude external sounds, and that may exclude positive sounds as well as negative sounds. The NORAH study, though, has shown some light on the fact that it doesn't seem to be an abnormality of speech perception or auditory discrimination that is leading to these effects, although I suppose those sorts of effects might occur at a younger age than the children studied here. Certainly an area to do with teacher frustration and communication difficulties. I think this is an area that is ripe for further research and is a very obvious area in which effects on reading could be mediated through that. And learned helplessness is another possibility, although there's not been so much research in that area. So what are the implications for this in terms of general classroom acoustics? I just want to quote a couple of interesting studies on London primary schools from Bridget Shield and Julie Dockrell. They found that noise levels in the classroom are dominated by children's noise. That in terms of background noise level, reverberation time in the classroom was one of the most important influences, and that poor acoustic conditions in the classroom reduce speech intelligibility. They also found that external noise, noise coming from outside the classroom, affected classroom noise only when children were tending to do quiet activities such as reading. On the other hand, they did find that both external and internal noise affected children's achievement scores. So both the classroom the noise inside the classroom, the noise from outside the classroom seem to affect cognitive achievement, adjusting for social deprivation. So how do we apply these results? I think NORAH provides methodologically powerful evidence for exposure-effect relationships for aircraft noise and children's cognition and health. And this sort of evidence should influence policy guidance for school location and design. And there needs to be work with classroom acoustics in reducing cognitive effects. Possibly one of the things that's been suggested is more sound insulation in classrooms. So what about further research? We do need longitudinal follow-up studies in this area. We also need to look at change of noise exposure studies, studies of sound insulation, and potentially intervention studies. And you have a golden opportunity here. Here you've got this wonderful study, these children who've already been studied. I hear yesterday there's a possibility of different interventions, an educational intervention and possibly an intervention to do with sound insulation. Why not put a bit more money in and study these interventions? This would be a real methodological step forward in this whole area. Now, it's not true that there have been absolutely no longitudinal studies. This is a follow-up from Charlotte Clark in our group of the UK bit of the ranch study. And what she followed people up, she followed the children up from primary school to secondary school. Now, there was a huge amount of attrition in that transition, unfortunately, but nevertheless, she did find a trend for reading to be poorer at ages 15 and 16 for children who had initially attended noise-exposed primary schools, suggesting that if you continue to be exposed to noise, you may still have continuing effects. And this has implications for lifelong learning. It has implications for what job you get, for what your prospects are, what your life chances are potentially, and this needs to be investigated. So, in conclusion, both NORAH and RANCH demonstrate linear exposure effect associations between aircraft noise exposure and reading comprehension in primary schools, children. The mechanisms of these effects are still unclear, but there's really no support from the NORAH results for the hypothesis that the effects of reading acquisition are mediated by the effects of phonological abilities, the sound perception hypothesis. There are implications from this study for interventions to reduce these noise effects and to develop further research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just have to say, please. Thanks a lot. Are there any questions? Gibt es Fragen von Ihrer Seite aus? Es gibt zwei da hinten, der Herr im blauen Hemd.
Two in the back, the gentleman in the blue shirt. Lochmann from the Hessian State Office of Environment and Rheology. Please, you have to speak into the microphone. I ask myself whether the effect of the RANCH study is so much bigger than the one found in the NORAH study. Mrs. Klatte?
Ja, ich habe ein Mikrofon. Also von der statistischen
in terms of
Effektstärke her
the
ist eigentlich nicht
statistical
größer oder
effect,
kleiner,
it's
sondern
not bigger
wirklich
or
gut
smaller.
vergleichbar.
I think
Wir haben
it's
gefunden,
very
mit
well
20
comparable.
dB
20
Zunahme
dB
der
increase,
Fluglärmbelastung an den Schulen, eine Verringerung der Leseleistung ein Fünftel
effect
Standardabweichung.
at schools, and there was a standard deviations, and that's the same deviation that we also found in the RANCH study. The differences are found in terms of the learning time. We found 2 to 3 months delay in learning, and in the RANCH study it was a longer period, I think, of delay, but this is always linked to how you design and standardize the reading tests. You can't directly compare. You can just compare the statistical values, and they're absolutely test values, and they're absolutely comparable.
In RANCH, on the pooled data, you see one thing, but if you compare the three centers, there's quite big differences between the centers, which might be related to the reading tests used in the UK, Spain, and the Netherlands.
Yeah, I mean, I think the results are very comparable across the two studies. There are lots of more minor methodological differences between the two studies that might contribute to slight differences, but I think really they're remarkably, unexpectedly comparable.
Thank you. Gibt es weitere Fragen?
Any other questions?
Da vorne, Herr Rösli. Es kommt ein Mikrofon nach vorne.
Mr. Rösli, the microphone is brought to you.
Vielen Dank.
Sehr
interessante Studie. Ich habe gesehen, dass Sie für Straßenlärm und Schienenlärm adjustiert haben.
Road noise and railway noise you adjusted. And did you look into the effect on the outcomes?
Also das haben wir nicht. Wir haben
No, we didn't do so. The schools were selected precisely already for that reason. Schools that were exposed very much were not included, exposed to road traffic and railway traffic, were not included in the NORAH project. We only focused on aircraft noise, and that was checked and controlled. Thank you.
Sie sind schon unterwegs, genau.
I asked my question after 5 blocks. Could you tell us, can you please speak directly in the microphone? I asked this question after 5 blocks have been dealt with, and the question is a general question to all scientists, not only the ones that are sitting on the panel at the moment. I'm highly impressed by the study, its quality, care and results. Today, the Ministers of Environment decide on legal improvements and protection against air traffic noise, but they won't do it because of the NORAH study, but despite of the NORAH study, at least how the NORAH study has been perceived in the public so far. May I read out from press releases on the 29th of October, for example, it says that the health risks of traffic noise are smaller than perceived in the public. The health risks due to air traffic noise are minimal. Noise disturbs but makes you ill. A new study sees less risk than expected, but obviously it has a clearer impact on the psychology. I'm not a researcher of effects, and I'm working at the interface with politics, and I ask myself if the press release refers to the same study that we have been talking about for 2 days now. I've got the impression that with respect to blood pressure, the result is that there is no effect, and within the framework of the study carried out so far, that was confirmed, and with respect to all the other effects, the findings have been confirmed that we had before, and with depression there are new findings. There is no reason to demand more abatement. So my question to scientists, is it true what the press releases say? Or is it that you have reduced your warnings with blood pressure, but not for all the other areas, and that we have to continue to fight for more noise abatement measures? Could you take this question into the lunch break? And I would like to know the answer afterwards. I think that's a question that can be answered really nicely in the afternoon when we have a look at the total NORAH study once again. I would love to give the floor to Mrs. Klatte, but we are not experts for blood pressure. Mrs. Klatte, would you like to say something on the children's results? Is it presented in a distorted way by press releases? The child study results were published about 1 year ago and were discussed at that time. At that time, I had the impression that the presentation in the media were rather according to the real situations more than today, and therefore we have to discuss it again. So I would like to transfer your question to the afternoon session. Any other points, any other suggestions or questions about the child study?
Mich würde interessieren, wie es weitergeht.
Would like to know
der nächste Schritt nach dieser
the next steps. What will be the next steps after the child study? What else do you have to do after range, after NORAH?
Wer möchte zuerst?
3 of you. Who wants to start?
So, wie auch im Vortrag von Steven Stansfeld, glaube ich, ganz gut dargelegt wurde, gibt es doch bestimmte Lücken in der Forschungslandschaft, und das sind vor allem die fehlenden Längsschnittstudien.
The longitudinal studies that we have not carried out. There is a follow-up of the range study, but the problem was that
beteiligte Kinder nicht mehr
children participating earlier could not be included.
Was dann eben doch nicht so ganz klar ist in den Ergebnissen.
This is not shown very clearly in the results. For the assessment, for the evaluation of these effects that we have seen in this one-off measurement, it's really important to know that. It's important to know how it develops further. What happens once they become older and attend higher forms of school? Most of these children continue to live under this exposure, and that remained open, and definitely we also have to look into the mechanisms. That is air traffic on the one hand, air traffic noise on the one hand, and the reading capacity on the other hand. So if you knew the correlations or the associations, it would be much better to take countermeasures and to become more effective with your intervention planning.
I'll try to keep it short. It brings up a lot of exciting ideas, but I think we should study the effects mentioned by Stephen in.
Could you remove your glasses? I think they're making
sorry. In younger children, as I mentioned in Sweden, I've participated in preschool children, and actually that was an intervention study where the ceilings were affected and the chairs got cushions, so they didn't make a lot of. And children of 3, 4, 5-year-old noticed these changes and really positively responded to the change. But that was only in 60 children, so I think that's a real future issue. The other one is that we should look, and not only for aircraft noise, but noise and health in children in general. How can protection be arranged in terms of providing quiet areas in cities or tranquil places near homes? So even if there is noise, there will be periods of quiet. and the restoration, the recuperation issue is important. And I would like to take the opportunity to say that we will organize a big workshop on noise and health in children next year, financed by my institute, by RIVM. So I hope we can draw a plan for future research there.
Thank you. Dr. Stevenson, what needs to be done now after the launch of NORAH?
Yeah, no, I quite agree that longitudinal studies are definitely a priority. But I also think intervention studies and studies that look at change in noise exposure and results in terms of things like learning and reading comprehension, because intervention studies can be a much stronger test of causation. If you can remove the noise and the effect declines, then that's very powerful evidence. And clearly, you know, there is a need here for these children who are chronically exposed to noise. There is a need to do something to try and help their reading. And that could be, I think, as was suggested yesterday, potentially one could think about some sort of psychological, some sort of educational intervention, or you could be thinking about interventions to increase the sound insulation of classrooms. I think both of those sorts of potential interventions are worth looking at.
Thank you. Es gab eine Meldung dort hinten. Vielleicht heben Sie noch mal kurz Ihren Arm, dann findet das Mikrofon.
Another question there.
Ja, Franz Uhan, erster Stadtrat.
Franz Uhan, City Councillor Mürfelden-Walldorf. The study, as Mrs. Klatte said, was presented already 1 year ago, and since that, quite a few measures have been taken, as far as I observed it, with respect to the beginning of the participation of schools and what they did in order to improve noise abatement in the classrooms, not only in schools that were studied and affected, but also others. And with the regional fund, other units are affected, preschools, etc., have not been studied with respect to the attention level, etc. Well, Dr. Klatte, I don't know in how far you have followed the discussions and efforts in Hesse, and I don't want to bring you into an embarrassing situation in how far you want to assess these efforts. What would you say with follow-up studies in the same setting? Looking at measures taken, could you then verify results that you found in the first study? You know, it's very concrete. One plane less, well, we didn't have that. But passive conditions were changed or are being changed. The second point, as observer of public discussion, I think it was really good. The presentation of results went much better. I hope it will continue to become better, but then the follow-up reaction of parents, affected schools or teachers, etc. Probably I'm wrong, but probably you can tell me otherwise. I think there were not many that responded. You know, no one actually was shaken up or encouraged to take more political action, saying, all right, that's the way it is, we have to tolerate that. That's rather what I have observed. Maybe you can give a subjective explanation. That would be really helpful for me. Thank you. First question was about the measures since NORAH. I've not followed this in detail, what measures are to be taken, etc. I know that there was a resolution with respect to sound insulation of very exposed schools, and you are happy to hear that. Whether that's enough, you know, I doubt that. I doubt that this is the only mechanism that can produce this effect. But the problem is that empirically we cannot answer it based on the data, whether it was noise at school in the classroom or noise children are exposed at home. And here we would rather start at one point, at one place, and then also children are not at school for the whole day. They shouldn't. They go out once in a while, and that's a problem what teachers reported on. That is, despite the air noise load, they did not go out that much, and that's a shame. It shouldn't be the case. So I can't answer, and for questions like that we should do longitudinal studies like Stephen Stansfeld has proposed, that is interventional studies. What is the effect of that measure and of that measure, and to see what happens in the course of time. And as to your second question, I forgot what the second question was, the reaction of parents. That's an interesting point. Quite clearly in the region after publication, also in front of schools, we carried out information events in schools. We offered that, and we had some actually, and we were surprised that only few parents participated in these information events. But I would not interpret it in such a way that they are not interested. You know, you have to compare it. In this group that we studied, we have a lot of children and parents that have other concerns, other problems than air noise, air traffic noise. And there is some hesitance to attend information meetings like that. 60% migration background, and you can't reach parents that easily to start such a discussion process. And then, what about the reaction to range? Were there more reactions, more responses of parents? Was there keener interest of parents?
I don't think there was a particularly keen interest from parents for the same reasons I think that you're saying, Maria. That is that, you know, parents of primary school children, they're pretty busy people. They have lots of things going on. Certainly there was a lot of response, though, from certain of the teachers. There was a lot of response from local newspapers when the study results came out, enormous response. So I think there was quite a lot of public interest. And discussion. Was that the same in the Netherlands? Yeah.
Actually, there was some, it was sort of posted in the papers by one of our future politicians, as if it was sort of exaggerated issue, which surprised us, but it gave us the opportunity to discuss it openly in programs. I think Elisa was in a television children's program where it was explained, or the children's journal or something. So, it was covered.
Yeah, I think there's a careful balance to be maintained here, because, you know, you don't want to alarm parents by saying that there is these huge health and cognitive risks, because what we're showing is it's a significant effect, but it's a relatively small effect. So you don't want to, some people complain that, well, you're making our residential area around the airport seem very unpopular and not a nice place to go. Well, of course, that may be true, but one has to keep it to a certain extent in proportion with other risks.
Thank you. Gibt es weitere Fragen, Anregungen?
Any other questions, suggestions?
Da vorne.
Oh, there at the front. Sorry.
Da kommt das Mikrofon.
Microphone comes there.
My name is Colin Cobbing from Arab. The question that I have is about intervention studies. You've elaborated about types of intervention studies that might reduce noise through noise insulation schemes in schools, homes, etc., and other design intervention measures. But could the panel please elaborate on other types of measures that could be studied in future?
Who's the first one?
Okay. Well, I mean, certainly educational interventions is something that could be looked at. So some sort of educational program trying to skill up people in terms of reading, I think that is a possibility. But I don't know, there might be other things to do.
I actually think at the teachers' end, because there's still this possibility that a lot of the effects are mediated by the teachers' irritation and less patience to explain things to children who are lacking behind. So maybe at the teacher's end, and we also saw that in younger children, the children actually complained of the teachers screaming at them. And the effect of an intervention was that they did scream less. Now, they've done studies like that in hospitals, actually aimed at the behavior of the nursing staff to reduce noise level. And that might be a way to go, to aim at the teachers rather than the children or the parents. But how to exactly do that, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Gibt es weitere Fragen?
Any other questions there?
Das Mikrofon kommt gerade zu Ihnen.
Gesundheitsamt Frankfurt.
Health Office Frankfurt. Don't want to be misunderstood and not concentrate on noise. What I would like to know about is the indoor air quality in schools, and there are studies that show if I have a bad air quality indoor, then the noise level is higher within the class. Also, there is more stress for teachers. And here I would like to know whether researchers have considered that and whether they see any demand of intervention. Indoor air quality and then the relationship with road traffic noise. There are a lot of schools directly at roads, I would say. Yes, that's a limitation of that study, that we have not looked into the air quality. We excluded that there is more air pollution, which had a negative impact on children. We made sure that there was ventilation constantly carried out, and there is also a follow-up study of French where you correlated it with air quality. We didn't do it in this study. We didn't look at the correlation of air traffic noise with worse air quality indoor. But of course you should consider that. We should also study this and also the combined effects. That is, we excluded schools that were not only exposed to air traffic noise, but also exposed to road traffic noise and railway traffic noise. So those were excluded, and therefore we can't tell you anything about the combined effect.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, as Maria was saying, that we did in the RANCH study have a bit of a look at. This wasn't internal air pollution, but air quality. It was just the general air quality. And certainly around a lot of airports, particularly Heathrow at the moment, there's a lot of concern about air quality. Now, we didn't find a relationship between air quality and children's learning, but other studies, for instance, a study from Boston that did show that black smoke concentrations were related to children's learning. So it is potentially a confounding effect of noise, and it's certainly something that I think future studies should take into account. In terms of the road traffic noise, I think that is another issue. We did look at road traffic in RANCH, but we found very strange results. We found actually that road traffic noise actually was associated with better memory results in summer. So this was curious, but that's against a background of a lot of studies, of earlier studies that have looked at road traffic noise and found similar deterioration in reading and other cognitive effects in relation to road traffic noise.
Thank you. Gibt es noch weitere Fragen, Anregungen?
Any other questions, suggestions, ideas?
Sie noch eine? Ja, gerne. Warten Sie kurz, bis das Mikrofon bei Ihnen ist. Dann können wir Sie alle verstehen.
Ich wollte nur noch mal kurz ergänzen, es ging mir nicht um die Innenraumqualität bedingt durch die Außenluft, sondern durch das schlechte Lüften. Wir sehen halt eben, dass in den Schulen doch extrem schlechte
ventilation. We have found that ventilation is very bad in schools. We have CO2 concentration 2000 ppm. And this really has a negative influence on the learning possibilities of children, the concentration capacity, and it would prevent a good learning environment. This is important for me, of course, outdoor air quality also, but ventilation and CO2 concentrations. That's what is important for me. This is definitely a problem, and teachers from exposed schools told us as well. They said that they tend to keep windows closed even if it's warm outside, because otherwise they would be disturbed because of air traffic noise. And, you know, I'm absolutely in agreement with you. Definitely that might be a problem factor as well. And then experiments have been carried out with ventilation systems, but then we had to find that many of the teachers are not so happy with them because they were too noisy as such as well, and with bad air quality they are not operating, and then of course they have this feeling that they want to open a window once in a while, and then systems like that are not so helpful, it's not accepted.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you.